this got a different vibe to it. This is the UTOK Psycheology session, which I hope will convey a little bit of something different, but very related in that. And so Masi and I were just talking, and it was, we think it was in November of last year, that actually was a meta state. And I was like, hey, you guys go do psycheology. And to know what that is, and I'll go into some slides here in a little bit. To know what that is, you got to know what UTOK means by the psyche. And I'm going to say it and then I'll say it again, especially because there's so many damn words. Everyone's using words, and this is the nature of it. You know, we're trying to find our way, and different language systems will then grab different concepts and then they get defined in each other, and so it makes good sense. So if you were paying attention, you saw Benita Roy basically say, here's the psyche in her frame, which is essentially where self would be in UTOK, and at least in the self-modeling structure, and as a generalized concept. And this is sort of a generalized concept, but it's a really different kind of generalized concept. So I'll say this again, but just as people gather here, the psyche in UTOK shows up at the end of the A New Synthesis book. So if you're one of the 4 people that actually read all that entire book, you know that at the very end of that book, it says, hey, after this whole new synthesis, there's an entire another concept, and it's called the psyche. And the psyche's not a scientific concept. Oh, Bard's in the audience. It's a pathic concept, not a logos concept. It is a concept that is centered on the concept of the subject in the real world, living as a subject, and located within their own point of view, situated in the real world. That's very, very different, of course, than a scientific perspective on the world that says, here's a generalized understanding from a third person intersubjective propositional way of understanding behavior and its unfolding, right? Versus, dude, here you are in the world, okay? Here we are, all of us, standing, sitting in chairs in our different locations, indexed in a particular coincidental state. That's really different than the scientific frame of explanation that would then say, oh, we're all talking primates that have atoms that in cells that go all the way down, and we can then try to explain this through logical generalized structures, okay, that we piece together. I'll draw from something John said yesterday. In small world experiments, we're going to build small world experiments where we control for variables, okay? And then we say, oh, out of these small world experiments, we can then extract generalized principles, and then science is going to stick together these generalized principles. They'll zoom back to the most generalizable and then add additional concepts that help us understand explanatory structures that enable us to stitch them together to understand differentiation. That's what science is trying to do. And you know what that means? It doesn't do anything with random error. And then science, by definition, error is a construct science is not dealing with. Shit happens, right? And there's no real explanation. A car just drew by your thing. Why does it have the license plate that it has on it? Explain that scientifically. There's no scientific explanation for multiplicity of different coincidences. And yet we are a multiplicity of different coincidences. And we're situated in a particular point of view. And the last thing I'll say before I bring up slides here in relationship to this is real for me in my training as the difference between a psychologist who's trained in basic human psychology, where my task, I try to figure out what the hell that was, but I'm a behavioral natural scientist. I'm really trying to explain the behavior patterns of human beings and their cognitive, neurobehavioral personality structures inside a social system. I'm trying to do that. And then I get in the room, right, across from a real other subject, okay, who has a unique, particular experience, belief, value, structure, place in the knower universe. And what I would say to them is, well, I'm a scientist and I'm a therapist, and my job is to use scientific constructs and my own, I wouldn't say this explicitly, but I position myself to my own ideas about what adaptive living is and how they go astray, and afford you these generalized concepts that my task is to be scientifically valid in, like, because as a scientist, that's why I'm a licensed professional and I do all this, I learn this shit, what's bullshit, what's not. I'll convey that to you, and then you take your unique subject and do what the hell you're going to do with it. You know, you don't say, so somebody who's a young earth fundamentalist in psychotherapy, you don't say to somebody that's a younger, actually, I'm a scientist and we figured out the earth is millions of years old and you've lived a lie. We don't say that. Okay. And for a whole bunch of different reasons, ethical reasons, but it's also the case that we have to deal with the unique particular subject in the real world. And I learned from Alexander Bard in particular, although I had access to this, that there's an irreducible knowledge structure. The pathic and the logos, you can't reduce the logos to the pathic, okay, or vice versa. And ultimately, I was already embedded in UTOK's conceptual structure. And that's why ultimately UTOK going to give us a vectorial system that aligns with narratology and says, hey, there's a logos, and the tree of knowledge is going to capture that. There's a mythos, and when I say mythos, I don't mean that meanly, but it is a narrative about where we ought to go relative to where we are as a collective. Garden actually points to mythos. And then there's the pathic, okay? Now, Bard will point to things like, oh, well, pathic gets expressed as like porn and snuff films. If you listen to Bard, like, holy good Lord, what the hell's he talking about? But actually, it's the narrative of the embodied real. Bard's a psychoanalyst, okay? What is the fundamental embodied real of the situation in the real world? So that's a long way of saying is the thing called the psyche. That's a concept that points to the unique particular subject living in the world that's not generalizable based on logos principles of explanation. Okay? You don't explain. But why? Because it's a bunch of error that actually collects us together. Science can build a generalization and then you stick all that together in the unique particular. Okay? But we're an experiment gone wrong. The scientist throws that out. Oh, we didn't control for the right variables, right? So that we had error, so we couldn't do small world shit. But we're living our real world error lives. That's what I would say. Okay, and then we actually love our real world error lives because that's what they are. They're our real world, and gives us an enormous amount of meaning. And we can use actually science to say we create a lot of value about that. Okay, so that's a basic structure. I'm super happy to say that Masi and I built this together. Our psyches came together, and I built psycheology. And so let me give you a little bit, we're going to give an overview. So what we have today is that Masi and I will share a little bit about this. There have been about 14 or 15, sorry if I missed anybody, 14 or 50, I emailed 14 or 15 of the closest folks who I really thought would get involved. And if I didn't email somebody that many just because I thought they were busy or whatever, but fundamentally, then we've been engaging in conversation, coming together for meetings and asking what this is. So now let me lay this out for UTOK Psycheology. Then Masia will pick up halfway through. This has been an idea that's generated first by me and Masia, and then we reached out to both Andrew and Baron to form a seed team, okay, that would then grew into a seed group. So we're trying to seed, of course, that's a metaphor, seed that's consistent with Tree of Life, garden stuff, and the UTOK seed. We're going to seed this and see where it takes off. That's what we are. So let me pop in and do a share. Okay. Here. And psycheology toward the reflective study of your soul. And as an old behavioral scientist, I can't believe I'm making a presentation on your soul. But if you were to ask me, hey, psyche, what's the root of it? And hey, do you, your behavioral scientist, know exactly what it's like to be another person in their embodied real? Is there such a thing? Of course. Does your science tell you what that is? Of course not. Maybe we should think seriously about that, right? So anyway, your soul and your psyche, and by the way, that's true to the meaning of the word back to Aristotle's psyche. Although he had a slightly different meaning than because we're really located in the subject-pathic real. And he was more concerned with the complexified forms of the psyche across actually exactly the TOK levels of plant, vegetative, sensory motor animal, and rational human. So what is it? Well, I've already said this. So it refers to your lived experience of being in the world as a unique particular subject. Psyche is. Ology, that's generally just a term, actually relates to logos, and it returns to the idea that you are then engaged in a reflective, refined analysis of a subject. Okay? So biology, astrology, doesn't have to be a science. Lots of ologies refer to science, but a lot of them don't. But the ologies are, hey, you're going to bring a refined analysis of the thing. So we're going to put these together ultimately. And of course, then we're going to bridge this over to UTOK, and we know what UTOK is. All right. I will say the UTOK book, The Unified Theory of Knowledge, framed at one point, this is actually an Andrew Robinson insight, that's like, hey, it's an operating system. Okay. And there's actually, and really then UTOK is potentially an operating system for your psyche as you reflect on it. And that's going to give us psycheology. But first, though, let's talk UTOK psychology. Let's talk about psycheology with a little more specificity. I've already started the process here, and this is embedded in UTOK's structure. I've already pointed to this, but really, if you look at it, man, are there a truckload of differences between the logos of natural science and the language of the subject. Okay, these are radical differences. All right, that then essentially say there's a real incommensurate aspect to these language systems. Okay, meaning they are structured in different kinds of justification. They're structured in different kinds of empirical evidence. They're structured in different kinds of goal tasks. But UTOK found a way ultimately to hold these in right relation, which I would argue is part of UTOK's solution to the enlightenment gap. Okay, and we've been talking about the tree of knowledge and mind and all that stuff, and we've saved this little nugget of the I-quad coin, okay, and the holding of the language of the subject for the end here. But it is actually very deeply related to this whole issue about, well, how do you take subjective knowing and objective knowing and put those together? And notice that's an enlightenment gap problem, not really a brain-mind problem. So the I-quad coin symbolizes, okay, the human identity functional matrix. That's what it represents. Human identity functional matrix. And that's got a couple of components to it. First, there's the human identity function, okay, which refers to an individual, all right, move my thing so I read this carefully, okay, who's having empirical experiences drawn through the senses. Okay, that's point one. So you're having a perception. Mind two, okay, perception down into whatever the root of that. We'll talk about things called isness, okay, but there's an instance of epistemic awareness that then actually, as it spreads for awareness, it will spread into the concepts and categories that afford meaning. Okay, so that's the human identity function is the top-down, bottom-up instance of awareness of a precept that then begins to spread. And then as you spread that across time in the person's schematic structure, you then think about it, you living in the human identity matrix. But this is a term that I connect, although I had before, but connect deeply to Rob Scott's stuff. In fact, I wrote a very popular blog based on Rob's stuff, Wake Up to the Human Identity Matrix, the matrix of associations that we make in making sense out of the world. Okay, so the human identity functional matrix are instances then networked into a matrix of identity. Psycheology can be then thought of as reflecting on your human identity matrix. I'm having instances and I have an identity across time, and that's my unique particular psyche. It's my unique particular human identity of agency and context, if we want to use a specifying term there. Okay. And then from there, we can then say, hey, there's an unreflective position, of course. Just ask. There's a fair amount of unreflective ways of being in the world. Okay. And you can, an easy way to position this, think of children adopting naive realist positions, okay, that their experience is reality. And we were all like this at 4. You were presented with the world. Your parents told you it was Santa Claus, and you took Santa Claus as an obvious fact of the world. It's just the way it was. Okay. So your psyche was completely transparent to you. We didn't make a transparent opacity shift. That's a term that we'll use a lot. You just saw through it, and you got presented to your pathic sense of the world as a 6-year-old was just it. And what your parents told you was true, and the rocks you picked up were real rocks that you saw that exist fundamentally in the world, which of course is sort of true, hopefully. Okay, but the relationship between, hey, what's going on inside your head relative to what's going on outside is a good question. All right. And we can place this now, if we start to think about bridging this over to UTOK specifically, we can be like, okay, this is mind 2, mind 3 domains, just living in the world transparently. There's mind 2, mind from the, because we're talking about situated from the perspective of the psyche. All right. And now we can think about the practice of reflecting on the psyche. Psychology is this general act of systematically self-reflecting and making sense of one's own psyche and identity and relationship to a worldview or guiding framework. I have actually 2 quotes in the UTOK, a new synthesis book. One from Carl Jung, which is a cool quote where he's reflecting back. He was a precocious little bastard, right? Carl Jung, and he's 11 years old and he's on the way to school, okay? And one day, and he has a moment of insight, which is a self-recursive awareness where he says, oh my God, I am me, and I get to do, this is Bobby's strange loop. He has a strange loop of self-awareness that allows him to reflect back on himself, and then that opens up a whole bunch of different questions. So that's Carl Jung at 11 opening the door to psychology. He's now, wait a minute, here's my psyche. All of a sudden, the psyche became opaque to him, and he made a transparency shift. And because he's, precocious, he gets to see that at 11. Some people go their whole lives and never actually make the shift. Okay, John Horgan, who was referenced in terms of made a comment about end of science and other things, also tells a story, but he had a very similar experience when he was a kid, and he was, preteen, headed out and going fishing, and all of a sudden he had an I am me experience, okay, that he talks about, and he yelled out to his buddies that were fishing. He's like, I am me, I am me, and his buddies were like, dude, quickly, get your rod ready, we're going fishing, I'm me. And then they kind of judged him, and he got scared, and he actually, it was more of a negative, anxious, am I alone? Do other people get this? Do other people get the implication of this? And he felt judged, and he sort of stuffed it, okay? Now, that's interesting, because then what's his unique awareness of it in the social context? As he nested in a sociant, to use a Bardian conception, versus other contexts in which we would celebrate this. But fundamentally, with both of those stories, you see psychology developmentally coming online. Models of hierarchical complexity tells us there's a recursive loop that's taken in consideration, okay? Now, we then can zoom out into the adult land and say, of course, humans have been wondering about this for a long time. It's structured by cultural, religious, and philosophical frameworks. We are obviously not the first group of individuals to systematically reflect on ourself in the world, okay? And that worldview, then, the self relative to the world, your worldview, shapes that structural understanding and your sense of existence, and obviously have. I mean, this is what the religious traditions and everybody else kind of point to. So we can now shift a little bit and say your psychology represents your unique particular worldview, which doesn't then mean that, oh, you have your own unique one that you built, but it is where you place yourself and then the pantheon of worldviews, okay, if you want to then identify with a larger system. If you know the meme flower, the meme flower represents the small me. That's going to be related actually to psyche. And then the metaphysical empirical center is the large scale belief value structures that might be informed. And so we can represent this idea of, hey, where do you go from an unreflective, transparent psyche to a reflective one, at least in the symbols of UTOK? We could say, hey, you were unreflective, and somebody like Carl Jung had this moment, and then all of a sudden became reflective. This is normally a much more gradual process, of course, and we get socialized in adolescence into it, and we start to, maybe, of course, even before, and you just take it for granted, and maybe you live your whole life this way. But then we can then say everyone that can answer the question, this is how I make sense out of the world the way I do. This is my philosophy, my worldview, my religion. Okay, I'm a Christian. I really believe. My dad, went through a whole transformation, believed Christ was real, really had risen, found that, saw the light, was born again, and lived for 15 of his years, from 20 to 30, maybe not even 8 of his years, 20 to 28, knowing that this was the real reality until he then didn't know it anymore. And of course, you could do this with Buddhism. You can build philosophies in relationship to this. You can look to Carl Jung and find his psychology, be guided by that. You can look to Integral. We can look to Alexander Bard. We can look to what Bobby's trying to do. There's lots of different elements, okay? And now we're here in this context, and we're going to argue that actually we can now zoom it back around and say, hey, UTOK Psycheology gives us a frame of reference. So I'm going to stop sharing there and see if there are any questions. This is the break in which I hand this off. Then, okay.
All right. Do you
Yeah,
want to address the question first?
Let's continue. We can come back to this.
And then we open it up. Yeah, before,
right, the one thing, this is why it's very important, at least in UTOK. UTOK, like narratology, argues you cannot reduce everything to one version of knowing that's either objective, subjective, or intersubjective. It is a transjective whole, and it's not even foundational in that level, but it argues that human knowing requires different contextualized vantage points. And for example, science is actually blind both to subjective qualia and is blind to morality. I mean, natural science. I used to ask my students this: is like, can you use natural science to prove that Hitler was wrong? And I don't mean inaccurate. I mean evil and bad. That's a really tough question, and I think the answer is no, actually, because science isn't natural science. At least, actually, is not a language system that allows you to move from the description of behavior that it affords into a prescription. That's the is-ought shift. Okay, that doesn't mean that is and ought are totally different things in the universe, but epistemologically, you can build language systems that are more is and relative to ought. Okay, and I think natural science is one of those. And in fact, if you have a natural science explanation for why Hitler was evil, I'd be open to hearing it. I haven't had any.
We don't have a coin to flip within natural science.
So yeah, what? There's no coin and
all
all
that. We'll get to what that language means.
Anyway.
Flipping your coin, flipping from descriptive, whatever your embodiment in the real is and your understanding of that, into an axiological commitment in the intersubjective space. So let me pick up from right where he left off and continue just explaining what the concept is and what we did in the group that we ran between February and now, and then we can open it up for whatever comments, and then Baron will go, Rob will go. So anyway, the question is, why a UTOK psychology in parallel with all these many other worldviews and metaphysical empirical systems, philosophies, understandings that can help you understand your self-world relation. What makes UTOK different? And I'd say that the 4 problems that it solves is what makes UTOK, add the building blocks of the theory so different and so unique, and why it offers something that is so conducive to a psychology that is coherent. So the enlightenment gap, of course, Greg talked about it yesterday, today again, as this major philosophical historical problem. Mind and matter dichotomy comes from that, and then all the other dichotomies that are problematic that ensue from that, and then the split between subjective, objective, and intersubjective knowledge, to Greg's point about those different language games that those vectors will play. Problem of psychology, then there's a domino effect between the alignment gap and the problem of psychology, because psychology then has a really confused ontology because it is right at this nexus point, right, between matter, mind, and between the sciences too, between the humanities and the social sciences and the natural sciences. So this problem of ontology of psychology makes it really complicated to situate ourselves in the world as minded primates, persons, as UTOK does. But that's another problem that UTOK solves. The problem of psychotherapy then is how psychotherapy itself, because of the problem of psychology, will lack a unified understanding of psychopathology, of human healing. And then the psyche, of course, let me just move you guys' pictures so I can see the slides. Then the psyche, as it splits from matter, and as we don't get a coherent understanding of mindedness, then we get lost on the psyche as well. But here's UTOK major difference as a psychology system, because it solves these problems. The 4 key ideas on the unified theory of psychology solves the problem of psychology. That's all delineated in the new synthesis and summarized in the UTOK book. And then the 4 key ideas on the unified approach to psychotherapy, the way that UTOK frames the alignment gap to solve the problem of consciousness, right, as it was mapped out by Greg on the extended naturalism presentation. And finally, the problem of the psyche that UTOK addresses with its framework of the aquat coin as a placeholder for the human identity matrix. So there's the psychology triangle that we use to help understand this concept and the process of psychology. There's the concept of psychology that is really important to hold in relationship to psychology, to science, and to psychotherapy. And then there's the process of actually enacting it in the real, which was the impetus for the group, for us running the sessions. And one metaphor that Greg already mentioned, of the transpassivity opacity shift can be represented with these eye-quad glasses. You put your eye-quad glasses on and you're able to see your human identity matrix and your identifications in the world. When you will pacify that and you're no longer looking through a transparent, you can actually reflect with the I and me realization. So UTOK psychology is about applying UTOK as an operating system, and we can symbolize this as this process of rotating and flipping the coin. That's a symbolism that we use, and here's how we can describe it as a little progression from that unreflective psyche in the world before you can actually use propositions to understand yourself and reflect on your self-world relation. And then the inversion of that coin, you can see that the coin is inverted on the first one. And that inversion symbolizes then when you're actually able to ask those questions. Who am I? What is the world like? What's my ontology, my epistemology, explicit or implicitly? The rotation into identifying your human identity in the world and being able to pacify and see that you are a human identity in the major wave of reality. And we symbolize that as clarifying what is. And in this context of UTOK psychology, that's embedding yourself, right, in that understanding of the world and of your own psyche in the UTOK worldview. And of course, you can have, like Greg said, different worldviews and different sets of beliefs and values to clarify what is. But here we're talking about UTOKs and how UTOK is unique in that. And then the flipping of the coin, if you have an eye-quad coin, you know that on the backside, there's a tree of life. And in UTOK, that's a core pillar of knowledge. That's an epistemological vector that refers specifically to the intersubjective vector of knowing. So that's where UTOK's mythos exists, in contrast with the pathos of the coin, in contrast to the logos of the TOK system. And that's when we make value-based assertions. And we call that flipping into the cultivation of what ought to be, what ought we to do in this context in time. And that's what the psychology process, dynamic process is like, or as we envision it. That's just a visual way to put it, the clarification of your ontology or epistemology in this context of UTOK's descriptive metaphysics. So that's going to be the TOK system, mapping a behavioral complexification in the world that includes mindedness, as we've talked about many times today, and maps the different domains of mind ontologically and epistemologically, and locates the psyche within that. So our psyche is our epistemological portal that can be identified in a particular context, in a particular trajectory in your human identity, rotated and flipped. So that's, I think, a helpful visual to see that process. But that's the group that we had. There's some people who are not in this picture who were also part of it. And we met between February and April. We called ourselves the seed group with this idea that it's a beta group and we'll test this out, experiment, see how this goes, see how it impacts us. And then maybe in the future, who knows, we can have birthings of other psychology projects. And this was the framework that we tried to structure the meetings upon. So we identified these three elements, right, that made up less leads to more, and that's learn, embody, and share. So we arrived at this because we think these are crucial anchors, to frame the process of reflecting systematically on your psyche. And the psyche process may be a subjective first person dynamic, but that exists in an intersubjective field. So that's why we have these three to be enacted in the group. So the learn, of course, is getting clear on a shared onto epistemology, in this case, UTOK, using the same language, being within the same language game. I think it's really something different that we can do with UTOK, because of course, you can put together psychology groups with, we could come from different worldviews, right? And we sort of do, but speaking from within the same language system is something unique about this. And the psychological embodiment I think to me, that's at the heart, that's the crucial aspect of psychology, because if we're talking about psychology, we're not doing psychology. Psychology needs, in this case, to be, enacted, embedded in the actual ideographic real. So that's what the embodiment piece is. And the share, this is a loose association with transcendent naturalism, but I think it's meaningful because the share can happen the way that we see it in different scales. So there's the sharing within our group, as we met throughout these different months, the sharing at this conference, sharing this concept and this process and the practices that we did with people in the conference, and then, with people in our lives, and then at larger scales. And perhaps, making this loose link here with the idea of the transcendent naturalism, which is a strong transcendence of maybe, if we have different pods of this or whatever, a network can perhaps cause some different type of emergence. This is just a list of the Learn modules that we did. So what parts of UTOK were crucial, for us to go through to identify this shared framework for us to operate from. And we identified the descriptive metaphysics of it. That's going to include those basic concepts and categories like the tree of knowledge system, the map of mind, the periodic table of behavior, the Jai dynamics. That's UTOK's frame for how we are human mental persons in the world, how we justify, how we influence, and how we operate on dynamics of investment. We also did the unified approach to psychological healing and growth, and that synthesized, in UTOK's common core psychotherapy. So the focus of that was, what are neurotic loops? How do we engender human suffering? And how can that be reversed through a common mode lens? Finally, UTOK psychology as a meta lens for the fifth joint point, and Baron's going to talk about that. And so I won't touch on it, but pretty much identifying where we are in the current cosmological unfolding of the universe, and then what ought we to do about it from within our psychologies. So some core insights that we had as a group, that we are unique ideographic human identities in the cosmic wave of behavioral complexification, so identifying the psyche in the world. And we are nested expressions of matter, life, mind, and culture at the time of the fifth joint point, that we're operating via these dynamics of justification, investment, and influence that are drawn from the meta theories in UTOK. And then the unexamined psyche, whenever that's living through transparent lens and not systematically reflecting, that can get trapped, right, in cycles of neurotic loops, which is what we call the negative events, negative feelings that are natural in response to those events, and then the secondary response that many times is maladaptive. We'll talk about that. Finally, we can shine a common mode flashlight. That's an important one, part of one of our modules to revert those neurotic loops, and we can exercise a transpersonal transcendent mode, which Baron will talk about. This is going to connect to Mind 4, which some people were interested in. And we can cultivate a pure awareness, and that's going to connect to Rob's point about isness and the shared reality that we can access, that we have this ability to access, where we don't need to always be gripping the human identity structure, even though we're kind of stuck in it. At the same time, we're not completely stuck. We have a pure awareness ground of witnessing that is possible. One final point, we wanted to share this little art project that Greg and I did recently. So that's our space in Gainesville, Virginia. And so that's one of the examples of the things that we like to do to get UTOK, out of the text and bring it into our lived experiences. That to us is a manifestation of our UTOK psychology. And, you can see those are the tree of knowledge colors, the meta, life, mind, and culture. And science on top, yellow is science. And the point here is to say that this is how this manifested for us, right? Managing our salience landscape so that the things that are relevant to us become salient in our space. We also did other things like a credo, a set of beliefs, values, and mantras to bring UTOK into our daily lives. But this can look like many different things, right? What is a UTOK psychology? What is that enactment? And that's what people will share here. And I'm curious to see what other people have to share about that, of what a UTOK enactment could look like of all these concepts that we've been talking about these 2 days. So, that was part of the impetus for this. We were curious to see, what is a UTOK psychology for different psyches in the world. Do you want to add another point to this, Love, to this final? piece.
No, no, you did a great job. We can take a few questions, or if people want to supplement that, I'm fine. Thank you.
I want to know which side is Marcia's.
The better one.
She did win. We had a little bit was so it's not like the ego gets dissipated here. We were battling it out, and I lost the paint battle on which column.
I
It
gripped
was
my
she
ego
was on the
really
right one.
hard to
They were
try to
very kind
win.
of on the picture. No way you can tell on the picture. You have to go in there with a magnifying glass.
Sure,
And
but
she beat the my.
matters. It's relevant when
It
you're
took
there.
her a little longer though. So if you multiply outcome by time on
Okay, so
recursive relevance,
effort per minute is different.
return on investment, it's energy by time is the behavioral investment theory, as is the basic unit structure of the universe. So anyway, that's enough of that.
Can you show the picture again? Can we see it? Can we see the difference?
You will
Zoom in very close. Oh.
So one side is Marcia's and one side is Greg's, and how did one side win over the other?
We just look more carefully at when you really look close, which one had a few more errors and mine had a few more, like paint dip.
One side was more.
Oh, that kind of.
One side is more symmetrical and cleaner. So anyway, there it is.
I have a little question, I guess.
Okay, then we go to Baron. But yeah, go ahead, Luke.
I was just going to ask, maybe could you all talk about after you did the painting, how have you incorporated that into your monastery that you kind of already had before, and how did it add to it?
Well, the short answer is I live in the basement apartment of my parents, and we're expanding the monastery basically. So we have pictures everywhere. We used to be this. We started it in an apartment in Charlottesville, and then we had to move, and then we did it in Brazil, and then I started it here where and then Marcia came, and then she had the idea. Those used to be white, and that whole room out there was basically did not have UTOK in it at all. It's my parents' old stuff. And I asked them, I think if I'm gonna be here, my mom, by the way, is dealing with some cognitive decline, and I'm here to help. But I said, if I'm gonna be here, we're gonna spread out. And my parents were like, okay. So then we were gonna bridge the monastery into the living room. And then we were sitting there one day, and Masu was like, hey, you know what those bookshelves could be? They're 4 layers. We could TOK those things. And I was like, oh my God. So then when she came, we painted them. And then there's the whole ritual. I mean, for us, the ritual of investing in the monastery is being in right relationship to the values of UTOK and honoring what in our little religious world is what's sacred in that regard.
And it's certainly a salience thing too, what's salient in your environment, in your home. We talked about home one time, Luke. So our salience landscape completely changes, and there's a lot of meaning that's added to it. The participatory relation with the space is completely modified. So that's what we try to optimize in what we do with the monastery.
All right, so there it is. So now let's hand it off to Baron, which of course was part of the SEED team, and of course he and I did a lot on the mindedness revolution, precisely because we've been on parallel journeys and now to intersect. Lovely. So Baron, take it away.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah, my name is Baron, and in the UTOK language, I'm a Mind One specialist. So my day career, I stimulate people's brains to change the functional activity of circuits in the brain, and in a variety of ways. And so one might say, why would I be interested in a psycheology, which is more of this idiographic first person experience? And for me personally, it's probably why I got into psychiatry in the first place. That at a pretty young age, having a fair amount of human identity, functional matrix fluidity, and not understanding how could I feel like an ego? How could I feel like the universe? How could I feel like essentially a minded, perceiving, experiencing, acting animal? And how did I have these social selves? And how do you make sense with that pathos, right? That experience. And then saying, and kind of going a little crazy actually. And then saying, how do I align that with a logos of what is? I actually went back to science and took more of these big picture frameworks that it's in UTOK, it's in UTOR, it's in a lot of things, and kind of rebuild a very generic mythos uh, in terms of how can I contribute to this process that's ongoing that we are. And so discovering UTOK was like a big upgrade for me in those things, and afforded a new language to describe some of the things that was happening. And I was with Greg, and we, was talking about what about a mind four, right? So arguably, if what kind of mind is operating that can look at a mind one, two, and three, right? So I would almost argue in our mapping, by definition, everybody on this call is for sure engaging various amounts of what I call a mind four, and I'll talk more about that. And then the other motivation I would say is, it's important to say from a pathos perspective of like we have the capacities as human beings to feel a genuine peace and love, and we can let that transform us inside out and come out. And there are some of us really ready for a transcendent naturalism, right? To say you have an ego, but you can operate in higher and lower levels of complexification within your own psyche. And that would change your cognitive light cone of like what you're interested in. So I do have some slides. I want to jump into that. Let me make sure I share. All right. So you guys can see that okay? Perfect. So for this presentation, I think I probably have about 12 minutes. So I may be speaking at a level at 2x speed just to get through it. But essentially, just kind of reiterating, there is this big picture behavioral view of the cosmos that we can reposition the mind in the world by clarifying mindedness, that we can upgrade our maps of mind and self. So we'll be talking primarily about mind four, and to look at our own psyche in our psychology through a kind of a multimodal mindful mindedness. So, we'll talk about a self model called TESPA, and this kind of stop and go process as a metapraxis that's part of an extended epistemology. Not sure why that's skipping ahead, but let's go ahead. So I'm not here to reiterate the TOK. I'm just more interested in actually kind of that recursive loop, that if we actually realize where we are, if we're at the top of that plane of existence, that each of us is this energy, information, matter, object, living organism, minded animal, culture, person, and perhaps an emergent layer, this would be part of our mythos, emergent layer coming out of that, then in a very real, arguably objective sense, we are just that whatever we want to call it, the cosmos, whatever we want, whatever term, that's actually less relevant, that we are that looking back at it. We're looking at ourselves and at each other. And that's a fascinating thing objectively. And to say, can we experience and know that subjectively as well? And I would argue that we can, that we can know that. Let me see here. Let me go next slide. Why is that not moving forward? Okay. There we go. I think we've talked enough about mindedness. I'm going to go ahead and skip through that. And we've talked a lot over the course of this conference about mind 1, 2, and 3. So I kind of wanted to take that next leap and talk about a mind 4. So if mind 1 is modeling life, mind 2 is modeling mind 1 in a sensory, perceptual, emotive action process that has an embodied experiential type of self and a perceptual experiential world. Then on top of that layer is this mind 3 that narrates mind 2. And that is where we get a sense of an ego and a persona, so our public private self. And that's where we have a further extension of our cognitive light cone, and it allows for a larger social coherence. I'm less familiar with some of Bard's work, but maybe that's where the sociant, maybe that there is a limit though of how sociable we could be. And then this kind of mind four, kind of saying the mind four, I would argue, epistemically is reaching back into mind three and mind two and creating what I call these four capacities: meta awareness, meta attention, metacognition, and meta systemic. For folks that are interested, Greg and I did a 12 or so episode on um, what was it? Mindedness revolution, and we go into extensive detail. So I'm just kind of glossing the surface here. But the idea that, in a very basic sense, it's if we talk, I'm using meta awareness. A simple way would say awareness, pacifying or aware of its own schema, and that phenomenologically feels like spacious, timeless, free, peaceful. And the empty version of it, and the fullness of it, there's a sense of love that then can connect with everything. And Rob will talk more about this. It'll be another term because it's less about the terms. This is where we're caught in a propositional trap. That I'm talking about something more a perspectival knowing, right? What is that knowing without a particular perspective? And then meta attention, I would say, is more of a procedural knowing that does involve perspective, right? So we can simplify into a sense of experiencing this moment perceptually, moment to moment to moment as it's arising. A lot of meditative traditions work both on meta awareness and meta attention, and metacognition, meta systemic processes. This is explicitly in UTOK for sure, of even just like using a calm MO of like cognizing about cognition at a psychological level between us or within us and between us, and metasystemic views of like how do we look at systems of systems and how they relate. And so even in the podcast, Greg and I talk about hyper subjects, hyper objects, systems of systems, hyper systems. Like, so what happens when the human being can cognize that they are that energy information stack, looking at itself and looking at each other as that, and like kind of conceptually, experientially feeling and knowing that. That's kind of cool. Makes, I would argue, a different type of self that then allows for a different type of integration with everything, everything in existence. So part of this mind for, if we think of it as a cognitive framework, what type of self would be associated with that? And so as part of this psycheology, I would say there is this, I use the framework of TESPA, TESPA. And what we're trying to do, arguably in the tripartite model, there's the experiencing, private, public self, and that is usually transparent to most human beings, right? Within an unreflective psyche, you're just experiencing what you experience. Most people are immersed in thought, and if they're running into mental health issues, it's a big challenge to how do I work with not being just immersed in thought and emotion and then reactivity and then get into a triple neurotic loop. So Calm MO is one of those approaches. So the idea arguably is how do we go above and below thought in a way? And one could think about that as a temporal window. So how do we go thicker and how do we go thinner? And that also changes then the type of complexification of experience. And so I think earlier I'd mentioned that I would point out a piece about Ruben Lakonen and Helen Slaughter. And so they compare like meditative practices as a type of deconstructing the self, so that in the Pythagorean tree of complexification, say even of experience, we're usually immersed in an ego persona perspective, and that we can actually step down, right? We could practice an attentional mindfulness and go down the meditative depth and get out of immersion of memory and imagination and actually get into the present moment of what's perceptually and emotionally arising without reacting. And we can go even further down and we say, let's look at what's looking, right? You're not actually coming back, we don't have good science or phenomenological examination to say you're actually coming from behind your eyes. That's like a construction arising within our experience. And that doesn't have to remain a thought. That is something that we can know directly. So I think of this metasystemic and metacognitive processes as a type of propositional knowing. So kind of talking about the extended epistemology. And the meta-attentive would be a procedural, how do I learn how to meditate, getting the feedback, learning a perspectival experience. And then I would argue you can go a step further um, of a perspectival knowing. And I think that's one of those, it'll sound like bullshit unless you know that what that is. And if you know what that is, you fucking know. I mean, it's just and it becomes part of the depth of your being experientially, and your description about it in terms of a metaphysics into natural, exonatural is truly secondary. I think it's important as we justify and explain things to each other, but it's actually less relevant. So as part of the TESPA, as part of this human identity functional matrix of self, and self and world, I kind of go through each of these. There's the T that has multiple meanings. So transpersonal, transjective, transcendent. So allowing for a transcendent naturalism, allowing for epistemic of subjective, objective, and intersubjective. Um, it allows for that expansion into a larger um, matrix of care. And we still have an ego, just like I still have a penis and I still shit. It's like I still have an organ, a mental organ of ego and a mental organ of persona. And I'm going to bullshit myself that I am some super transpersonal person unless I learn to integrate and work with my ego and my persona, right? And a lower level on that stack is just our experiential self, right? And so that's something, if I'm immersed in thought, I could take a step down into. And more something that Rob will talk about is some sense of grounding in this isness. And again, less about the terms, but like this experiential knowing that knows, right? And that can feel spaceless and timeless and selfless and effortless. um, I was going to go through a practice, like an epistemic practice. I think due to time, I need to just be propositional and say, moment to moment, there's one thing about talking about this, but I would say as an embodied practice, so there's learn, embody, share, that moment to moment, one can do a multimodal mindfulness, right? And so one has the capacity to look in, look out, look between us, and look back at awareness. Those are using all four of those capacities. Um, and there's more, it's almost a type of, I would call it a type of recursive relevance realization, where what's most relevant, right? And usually as people work on this, it's like noticing where the tension is like a mental, emotional, perceptual, interrelational, there's different places. But as people learn to work through this, they can actually see what a kind of coining with the qualia tree. So if I'm thinking about evolution and Big Bang and a lot of the things we talk about, that's a high abstraction metasystemic process. I could step down into memory and imagination, and I have this moment to moment simulation of me through time experientially. I can go a little step down into a lower level of the construction of a self-worlding process that arises in this sense of awareness, or I can totally desimulate and deconstruct into formless awareness. So about at time, I just would point out the way I almost live this for myself is like on a vertical and a horizontal dimension. And that's an oversimplification for what am I horizontally, what am I doing out in the world, like family, friends, my work, sense of community, seeding the digital metaculture. And that's like a on in an extension in time. But then there's like right now, what am I doing? How am I living right now? How am I aligned right now? That has both a progressive path of like something I keep developing through meditation and psychotherapy or contemplative practice, but also this direct knowing right now that's not waiting for anything to happen. So that's why I kind of call it stop and go, because stop waiting for like something to be happening that now you feel okay. That there is a way, there's a knowing that knows that is radically okay. And we can discover that, and the traditions have been talking about this for a long time. And yeah, this is something, and I talk about the unified tree and the knower, which was some articles that Greg and I wrote. But essentially, I would argue you can align these dimensions of your being. That is a type of rotating and flipping the coin, and aligning your own pathos and your own mythos with a larger metaphysical empirical framework, which we align with UTOK. I would just mention, in a very real way, some of this does involve what we talk about with recursive realization and predictive processing, where one can experientially understand the simulation, and in a very Indo-naturalistic framework that's emerging out of each of us is this, each psyche is this phenomenal virtuality bubble emerging out of this living organism that is totally embedded and interconnected with the entire matrix of existence and the observable universe. And there are a lot of ways we can know that. And then last, I think my last slide that I'm going to mention is that I would try to argue that this type of development of a mind for TESPA, this type of psycheology, has the capacity to align people to be ready for what's emerging, right? Arguably, if we're coming just from an egoic standpoint, we're probably going to have a really hard time with what's ahead. So, and ultimately, this kind of, I said, UTOK, you realize the cosmos objectively, subjectively, and intersubjectively. So what a cool goal of, like, if we could realize that objectively and within ourselves and between ourselves, and what we would create differently, that it's important to update our metaphysics, our metapsychology, our praxis, our metapraxis, and understanding our nature of experience. And this one I will skip, but about, could we find deep psychological universals to encourage everybody to go after? But anyway, enough said. Thank you.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you. Woohoo. All right. So we've got T, or at least that's a placeholder for T in relationship to our identities, pointing very much also to A, but we will use that to pick that up. We'll go to Rob Scott and invite him to hear his thoughts on psycheology.
Amazing.
Aaron,
All right.
I'm sorry, Rob.
No,
Go
please.
I felt my urge to yell exo-natural as you were presenting.
Yes, that's it.
All right, good.
Hold on, let me pull this up and share. Can you guys hear me, first of all?
Yep.
You can hear me? Yeah?
Yes, fine, yeah.
Let me open this, and I'm going to share this. Okay, so waking from the dream. Let's get dramatic, right? Like, yeah, let's make this really dramatic. First off, I want to say I'm deeply grateful, number one, for being here, but to Greg and Marcia and Baron and all the other presenters, everyone here who's participating in doing this. I think of this as some of the most important work we can be doing. Over the last couple of days, we've explored incredible models of the mind, maps of the architecture of meaning making and identity and self. And today, in this little, really hopefully very short presentation, I want to point to something that I consider to be even more fundamental, which is maybe not just a way to navigate the self, but a deeper way to see what the self actually is, and maybe even wake up to something that's both prior and potentially beyond it. Okay. So we're here to explore psycheology, Greg's term for this deeply personal, subjective experience of being a culture person and navigating this inner world in the singular, right? Like as us. Baron just gave us a great talk. He's shared a longer talk on the same stuff that charts the intricate architecture of Mind 4, self, the TESPA stack, and different practices that can cultivate skillful mindfulness and evolution, right? I've heard him say things like the phenomenal virtuality bubble, right? I don't know if you said it today or not, but like I love that. And you could think of that as a constructed reality that we inhabit. And building on this, I want to visualize our own psycheology as a dynamic, shifting, almost labyrinth of self, okay? A world built of meaning, perception, and prediction. And there are lots of paths, right? UTOK, TESPA, what Baron showed us, all the different ways to become master navigators within this labyrinth. But today I want to share my own psychology, my own journey through a particularly dark labyrinth, if you will, and explore the possibility of not just mastering the maze, but of maybe waking up from it entirely. And I call this a fundamental shift to identifying with, but not necessarily, it gets weird because identity, I'm going to put it a level 4 of complexity. But it's to the ground upon which all the labyrinths arise. Okay. So first I want to see if we take a second and feel into this labyrinth, this reality bubble that we might be in. So, as I'm talking, your sense of self, the you right now, part of it feels solid, continuous, permanent. But I really want to focus on how it shifts, right? The you that's facing a potential threat is different from the you that's receiving praise. It's different from the you lost in thought. And each of those yous doesn't feel exactly the same, doesn't have the same cognitive light cone. It probably, it comes back to a constant story of you because that's useful in a lot of ways, but there's very different versions of you. Okay, the goals shift, the feelings shift, the way you perceive the world shifts. And so this felt difference is this labyrinth that changes like its shape around you, right? The walls subtly rearranging. And so this is our reality bubble, our own personal reality bubble. What powers this constant construction? What's going on with that? I'm going to argue that it's helpful to consider that we aren't that one solid self, but instead an active, relentless process or a function that I call selving. Our minds are prediction machines, as Friston suggests with the free energy principle, to navigate the self that's inside constantly defines a me versus not me, creating literally a functional boundary or a Markov blanket. And this active boundary creation is the selving function, generating what I'll argue is our entire self-world model. And because it's selving, it's not static, right? It's a continuous activity that's generating a changing self-world model. Again, that model not only models what you are, right? What we might think of as our personal identity, but it's also modeling what we think the world is, what you're not, okay? But what you are and what you're not, those boundaries, they're not real permanent things out there. They're constructed from meaning, and they're constructed through, Levin earlier talked about the importance of categorization and being able to change categories and consider them. Our meaning is getting constructed by how we're categorizing, how we're justifying, and how we're perceiving, okay? So if you think about a dream, why aren't we constantly baffled asking, how did I get here? Like, what just happened? In a dream, you usually just accept that the context that's given, right? Like you sort of show up there. You don't bring a history with you, and you're just now, one moment you're on the beach, next moment you're in a classroom. It feels seamless, right? You take the story that you're handed and you live inside it. I'm going to suggest that waking life isn't that different from that. The context might feel longer, but the context that you're operating from, what feels urgent, real, personal, we would argue that it feels like the whole story, but it isn't the whole story. In any moment, you're loading up different parts of your story to match the moment. And it's a tiny shifting subset of all the meaning that you've ever encountered, okay? So a person walks in the room, a news headline pops up, a specific memory surfaces, and instantly our context shifts, which triggers a cascade. Our identity structure, what we think is us and not us, subtly or sometimes dramatically reconfigures through association and dissociation. Association being the gripping of the relevant identity, and dissociation pushing away what seems irrelevant in the moment, ignoring or looking away from, literally dissociating from. So I'm going to argue that if you can see that happening in you, it's a good argument to think about it like you're not one self, you're a selving function, a dynamic living process of weaving meaning, drawing boundaries, and rendering lenses about yourself and the world constantly, okay? So John Vervaeke's recurring relevance realization, the ongoing process of figuring out what matters now based on our goals and predictions, fits here really well, right? This is also what I think the free energy principle is arguing for, okay? Whatever meaning feels most salient, most real in the moment is what we tend to grip. A new piece of information, a shift in the environment can instantly reconfigure our entire felt sense of self. And it does this through this unconscious association dissociation that is this function that I'm talking about. Okay. So, along with context, the world changing around you, memory plays a huge part in this. Okay. But memory, I would argue, and Mike Levin has done a ton of work on this as well. It's not what most of us sort of naturally think it is. It's not a recording of the past or a database of facts. It's more like a collection of engrams or seeds, right? Core beliefs, compressed narratives, core meanings that we've taken, survival rules from our past. And these get merged with our current context to make new meaning, okay? So these beliefs become the invisible lenses, the unconscious patterns that shape your psycheology, all right? And I have a visual for this. We are making meaning about the world all the time. And we use these concepts, these engrams in the solving function to do this perception game, okay? So we can imagine that one kind of concept that we have is a memory, right? And I mean, this affects you every moment. This is happening all the time as time is passing, what's going on. These memories or meanings get pasted on to whatever's happening in the moment, but we don't notice that this is happening. We don't see that the memory we're pasting on top of reality is affecting it in this way. I would say that this alters what you're perceiving in a really important way. And then also in a meaningful way, your old concept gets re-perceived, right? Even when the memory isn't really happening again. So it's in a way like you literally re-see parts of the memory again. Your old concept gets perceived again, which of course changes the concept, right? It changes like the perception of reality about the present moment. So unless we know that this is happening, we're literally not seeing reality accurately. And because of that, we're not having our best thinking about reality. So this is another way to try to describe the reality bubble that we're in, right? Our own personal perception bubble. We don't usually see how our own psychology is affecting this, okay? But what then happens is this puts another tick in the engram, and it creates arguably a new memory, but often categorized very similarly. And so this calcifies the original meaning even more deeply, okay? So it makes it even more likely that you're going to believe that concept again and again and again in the future. Now, if this isn't useful, that's a real problem because it makes the lens, the belief that you're looking through that's, you know, altering things, makes it harder and harder and harder to perceive the world closer to truth and more optimally if we have limiting lenses as an argument. So here's what this looks like at a party. You have a lens or a memory about Uncle Tony, that he's mean, and that lens doesn't just affect the relation with Tony. It's not there. It literally changes your psycheology in the moment, and it can affect the entire party, changes how the whole party feels. And that notably will change how you remember not just Tony again, but the entire party, right? It's like dragging its meaning through other experiences. So notice that Tony wasn't being mean in the moment. He was simply serving food, but we perceived him as mean because we maybe had a past engram about him being mean, etc. Okay. So this meaning, this gripping, justifying, shifting, selving function, I would argue that this is kind of the engine of the level 4 psycheology, right? On the tree of knowledge. This is the culture person plane. This is, as we identify as a self, this is the function that's running in each of us. And we don't see the beliefs lenses. We don't see the self. We act as the self. We are coming through that. We see through lenses. And in a way that leaves us lost in a waking dream, right? In the dream that it's projecting. And it reinforces the very predictions that it created, right? To stay safe, to stay in the pattern of whatever's going on, which is useful for survival. We're not saying this shouldn't happen, but I'm just noting this is what seems to be happening. So to share my own personal psycheology, right? Because this isn't just theory for me, right? This is my early psycheology was brutal. I was sexually, physically, emotionally, mentally abused throughout my entire childhood. By the age of 7, I was already using drugs and alcohol to feel better, to escape and dissociate and survive. As I grew up, my path spiraled into jails and halfway houses and institutions and hospitals. I lost many friends to suicide, my 2 best friends, as a matter of fact. I got cancer because I was so dysfunctional, I almost didn't care and I didn't really address it. It spread through my whole body. I had to go through a very aggressive chemotherapy. I was homeless. I did every heavy drug that you can name. So my psycheology wasn't just painful, it was arguably lethal, right? If I'd kept that for too much longer, it would have killed me. And it killed people that I knew. So those experiences became like the abuse, the things that I did, you know, in my early adult life, things that I was in control of were as traumatic, you know, as things that had happened earlier, arguably, like just terrible things that I experienced as a young adult. They become those potent engrams, right? Predicting a world of danger and pain, leading to beliefs and behaviors that are expressed as incredibly deep dysfunction. Okay. So one version of growth out of this, without a doubt, is mastering the tools, understanding UTOK. You know, what I do, identity shifting, things like TESPA, understanding and stepping into an identification with mind 4, right? Super important. For a long time, I thought about my life, and I thought that the work was about fixing myself, building a better identity, healing the broken pieces, okay? And to be clear, that work mattered a lot. It saved my life. But there was something deeper, and I really want to point out that this deeper is not necessarily beyond or better or after or anything. Shifting into what I'm trying to point to, that I'll get more clear about in a minute, actually affords us a better ability to do the level 4 tools, right? It leads to a higher functioning at level 4. So for me, there was something much deeper waiting. Way back in 1991, through a moment of profound clarity, something in me shifted. I saw directly that I was not my past, that I was not my trauma, that I wasn't the endless story of suffering. And what seemed much more real, much more knowable and true was that I was awareness itself. I wasn't inside the dream was appearing inside me. It was like this deep shift. And from that realization, for me, everything changed. Okay. If we go back to mastering the labyrinth, right? Mastering these tools, we absolutely want to do that, right? If we get trapped endlessly running these loops that are fueled by painful or limiting engrams and memories, right? That's the core of so much dysfunction for us. And in a way, we end up feeling very comfortable in our dysfunction. We live with dysfunction and don't challenge it because it's familiar, which is another part of the free energy principle. We want to keep similarities happening, even if they're negative, right? Change and difference is scarier. So that core dysfunction, this is where level 4 mastery comes in. You know, what I do, which is I'm suggesting your identity is shifting all the time, but there's a way to consciously shift your identity, right? Using frameworks like Barron's 4M and TESPA and Stop Go, we can learn to navigate the labyrinth of self incredibly skillfully. We can learn to opacify the lenses. We can make the invisible visible. We can bring unconscious into consciousness. We can change our relevance realization. We can examine engram seeds and repattern them, right? We can learn to reinterpret the past with a different meaning so that our meaning making in the moment changes. So just that alone, changing the meaning of attached old wounds is hugely powerful to be a healthier self. There's no question. So for me, it involved transforming the meaning of profound trauma and I'm broken and unsafe into I'm resilient, I can help others, right? Those types of things taken as real, a reinterpretation of the past, get shown in a very authentic, different way today than I'm a victim, I'm broken, the world is dangerous, etc. Okay. So this is powerful, life-changing work. And it's like mastering complex rules of mathematics, right? There's so much there with the influence matrix and this. There's 1,000 tools to apply, and it all really matters, okay? JII, right? All the stuff, okay? They're incredibly valuable, but is mastering the self and learning what I call conscious identity shifting, is that the end of the journey, right? Is mastering the labyrinth the same as leaving it, okay? So I'm going to suggest that this fundamental shift is different. It's not getting a new lens. It's not perfecting or polishing a set of lenses. It's the experiential knowing that you are awareness, you are the awareness in which all the lenses, all the thoughts, all the identities appear and disappear. It's waking up from the self-world dream, that Markov blanket, okay? So my journey, immense darkness, abuse, addiction, facing death, you know, in many ways, but cancer comes to mind, but I was almost killed by police a few times, like just car crashes, all kinds of stuff. I didn't overcome all that solely by mastering my identity. The ultimate freedom for me came from this shift, this direct realization of a different kind of awareness. It's a relationship to awareness that's different. All right, I don't want to put it in a new category. It is the awareness that we all have, but it's a different relationship to that awareness. It's a different realization. Okay, so it's not trading one identity for another. It's not becoming the awareness guy or the awake teacher or the sage. It's not another identity. It's resting as the boundless, peaceful space that's always been here before the trauma, during it, and after it. So it's simply being awake, okay? And the most useful feature of this awakeness is that you can objectify this selving function, this gripping selving function. You can objectify that itself. You can see the whole prediction engine, the whole labyrinth weaving process that's running. So if we think about the free energy principle again, it's trying to minimize surprise. That selving function, the relevance realization that's going on, is trying to minimize free energy, right? Trying to match its prediction to the world, all right? So the further our prediction is from the world, the more that sense of self freaks out. Free energy goes way up and we start to suffer, okay? But rather than just minimizing free energy, what if you stop the prediction process entirely? Stop looking for relevance, right? The free energy immediately drops fully. The system settles fully if that's done authentically and in a real way. So true non-dual awareness acts as a root level override to the selving that might be captured and stuck. And so I want to say it in this way. It's a radical refusal to keep feeding the prediction engine with identification. And I really didn't want to use a lot of big words, right? If there's 2 days of presentations with 1,000 big words and references and difficult things, I really want this to be simple. I want us to see that it's literally right here for all of us. But if you're tracking what I'm saying at all, you stop feeding the prediction engine with identification, with a claiming of I am this or that, that is this or that. There is a root level awareness that is prior and beyond that, okay? So you stop trying to fix the loop. You stop running it by stopping identifying with it, all right? So the old models are not painfully rewired. They literally become irrelevant. They become unnecessary, okay? And so the reason experiential knowing is on the slide is that this is a different kind of knowing. It's experiential. And I heard Barron speaking into this a little bit, right? It's experiential, not conceptual. It's not about justification. It's not a separate self trying to talk about truth from some partial perspective. It's literally a seeing that it's happening in this moment and in this moment and in this moment and in this moment. I see it. And so it needs no justification. So I don't want you to believe me or believe in me or believe in anything. This is experiential, and it's something that will be realized in you or it won't. All right. But once you truly see, or not just know about and believe a story I'm telling, but see for yourself your own selving process, I'm going to suggest that you probably can't unsee that. you'll know that identity is a fluid construct because you see it happening. You see the gripping wanting to start, okay? You might still play with identities. That's part of the beauty, but the compulsive gripping is gone. You know you're not just the self, okay? So this can be known through experience, and awareness itself is the proof, all right? So from this space of awareness, we still do all the healing. We learn to opacify the lenses. We make the invisible visible, stop, go. We examine engram seeds and crucially learn to reinterpret our past. We can change the meaning attached to our old wounds, right? But this is a different level, okay? So what is this level 5? We're here, right? We're doing this, okay? We're trying to define what might this level 5 be, what's going on, all right? And we think it might be digital, right? At each level of this stack, we're seeing very different complexity. And our digital plane, all the AI that's going on, all that, it's certainly complex, right? There's a lot of complexity there. But is level 5 digital? I don't know, right? I would argue that the AIs are still doing justificatory labeling and language type stuff primarily, okay? So one of the other things to consider is you could imagine removing a few of these layers, right? And ending up with something that looks like this, that doesn't need the biology and all of the different stuff that's us if AI is level 5 or it's this digital complexification, okay? So here's another option. And it too is different in complexity. The selving function that might be judging what I'm saying right now is going to go, oh, I know what that is. That's a stillness and there's no complexity there. And oh yeah, but that can't be it because that's less than. That's actually removing some of the things. I'm going to argue that in the same way a structure that is highest complexity is lower on the tree, and I don't love the higher lower stuff, but just differently down here, doesn't perceive or can't understand what's happening above in a meaningful way. It really misses it. It sees it in the world, but it doesn't understand the workings underneath that's going on, okay? And so I'm going to argue that this level up here is also different in complexity, and it's probably unseen from below it, but I'm suggesting that we have access to it in a meaningful way and that it's profound and it can change everything. So what does it feel like, an awakened state, right? What that's profound and grounded, not just a state experience because I took some shrooms, or not just a one moment, but then my self slams right back, right? What are the profound level 5, if we name it level 5, right? Markers. I'm going to argue some big ones, but there's so many more than this, okay? But I'm going to argue that non-duality is a big one. And what that means for the psycheology of the individual is the default judgment valence muscle that's constantly going good, bad, like it, don't like it, toward away, all that duality that's going on there, that muscle relaxes. The reactive judging mind quiets. Resistance to what's going on softens. And I'm going to argue that this is potentially the end of psychological suffering. Pain remains, but resistance and suffering starts to fade. Fear of all kinds, even the fear of death, because it's tied to that limited self that's trying to hold on, that all loses its power. Okay? So non-duality is a really big marker of that. Another one is oneness. All right? Conceptual boundaries and categories, right? They tend to dissolve. It doesn't mean we can't perceive them or see them, but their meaning and their permanence dissolve. So things like self-other begins to dissolve. Inside-outside begins to dissolve. And in this non-duality way, good-bad begins to dissolve. And it turns into a felt sense of oneness. It's not a felt sense of separation, but deep interconnectedness. Okay? Another aspect of this is timeless presence. There's a perceived cage of linear time that we feel trapped in. This just happened. This is going to happen. What do I need to do? That's a function of the selving gripping. That's what's going on there. Okay. So that perceived cage of linear time begins to fall away. There's an experience of timeless presence. You get to rest in this much wider, more real now moment that is active, but it's not a thing we leave. Okay. And then also space takes on a different quality. The quality of space itself shifts. Contained and separate, and you're there and I'm here, and there's space between us. Contained space becomes boundless in a sense. There's a connection. There's an identification with more. The cognitive light cones and collective intelligences that Mike Levin was talking about, identifying with bigger things can change what your cognitive light cone is, right? There's an identification with more than just this separate thing that I can start to identify with. And I have all kinds of examples from other talks that, identifying as defending your country, you'll give your own life for the country or the idea of the country, or being a parent, you would give your own life for, your kids, et cetera. We're doing this kind of stuff all the time, but there's a all the way out version of this. Okay. So, crucial difference. I'll wrap up. I think I'm probably long. I don't know if I'm long or not. I apologize, Greg, if I've gone too long here, but like a crucial difference to some of the Eastern traditions, or maybe even misunderstandings of those Eastern traditions, is that being awake and like kind of vilifies the ego in a way. Being awake transcends and includes the labyrinth of selving and everything below it, right? As Baron mentioned, he still goes to the bathroom, right? There's like that whole stack is still there. It's not, we're not like shunning that or making it bad, okay? And this is not a bypass to the complexity of the culture person plane. Again, level 4 skills matter, right? But I'm going to argue they become even more potent because we're not gripping from a self that's trying to fix itself in a way that it doesn't really exist anyway, okay? So now those tools get wielded consciously and wisely by awareness, not by programs that are actually continuing to define the prison that it thinks it's in. So you engage with the world, with relationships, with challenges from a place of freedom and clarity, and you can embody different identities playfully, authentically, purposefully, without being lost in them, fully defined by them. So isness is simply present, and then labeling it as beautiful becomes a conscious appreciative act, a choice that we can decide to make should we want to. Okay. So as we contemplate this 5th joint point, the future of consciousness, is it just more complex information processing, a digital peak level 4 justification system, or is it truly revolutionarily a different horizon, this capacity for this shift, which I'm going to argue is a potential waking up out of the labyrinth of self to ground a psycheology in boundless awareness, where we can see the psycheology arising, right? But still remain beyond the duality that fuels so much conflict and suffering, all right? So this is pointed to by sages across the millennia, of course. This accessible experiential knowing as awareness, it's this shift beyond duality of self-other, grounding us in the potential of oneness, presence, and freedom. And it's not something merely to believe in, but it's a potential, I think, that each of us can realize. And maybe it's the foundation for navigating a future with genuine wisdom, creativity, and compassion. So thank you.
Love you, brother.
Hey.
Thank you. Am I still sharing, or did that end? I don't know.
No, you're still sharing, brother. We're all sharing, right? Yeah.
Woohoo!
Thank you. So we're gonna go to Brandon, but as we do, thank you to everybody. And we got Brandon and then Andrew, and then we'll take some questions, see what else. But one thing I have to say about Rob's presentation is it's just profoundly moving for me. So I'm doing a lot of solving, a lot of meta mind shit.
Yeah.
Right. Rob and I come in contact, and it is through our contact in October 2020 that the awareness of awareness is made. And I then have, it's kind of interesting because Rob's story is so touching, but it's sort of like from the bottom he finds it, and that's a fucking miracle, quite frankly. And I say that just dripping with respect across everything. I'm climbing up, just that's what I'm in the midst of doing. And then in 2020, something happens while I have an insight around the iQuad coin talking with Rob, and there's a rotation, and it is the rotation into awareness through. And then I have a 2-week experience that Rob knows is of wisdom energy. And then you talk about the free energy principle, and I stopped talking. I stopped thinking. Not really, I mean, but it's just sort of like, oh, it's beyond the construction of this construction. As cool as it is, right? And once you see it and have a perspectival awareness, I'm not sure we've used that term before, Baron. A perspectival awareness.
That came
Yeah,
out
nice.
of yesterday. I was just the perspectival knowing, and I'm like, well, this is a perspective.
Anyway, so it's another opportunity to thank you, Rob, for helping me in that, and so this is awesome, and you're a great presenter, and you articulate it in a beautiful way. So
Thanks, man. Deep bow.
So,
thank you.
All right, Brandon, we'll go to you, and then I want to have opportunity to make sure everybody goes. Then we'll have more of an open discussion. So.
All right, thank you very much. Yes, and there are a lot of elements of UTOK that involve, transitions or integrations with, mindfulness and phenomenology. Like with the calm MO, that's the metacognitive observer, and the TESPA, that's the transpersonal, transjective, transcendent. And if we're talking about the psyche here, there's elements that are actually very, very important to this, which is the influence matrix, the behavioral investment theory, and the justification systems theory. And those come together, the justification, influence, and investment, that's JI dynamics, as Masia was talking about earlier. And I want to talk about how we can have mindfulness inquiries into the JI dynamics. We can have meditations around this. We can understand what we're focusing on, or at least we can have some mindfulness around what we're investing, our mental, our cognitive capabilities into, what are the influence factors? How are we justifying ourselves? We can become mindful of these factors and how they interact and determine our consciousness, and we can have greater inner peace and also more peaceful and more meaningful social relationships. And so to unpack this a little bit, and I could say, so I'm a student at the California Institute for Human Science. I'm also a community developer. I work in community development. And I've been looking at how to bring the inner development goals to community levels with these like circles of people, providing certain kinds of therapy to each other, probably guided by, therapists if there is one available. But how to do that? So I'm not even a therapist. I'm more of a sociologist, but I just wrote this because nobody had, and can't say that this is, at the highest level of professionalism, that the other presenters here would have, but this is part of a dialogue. So I'm just took a crack at this, just to unpack these concepts. Like, for example, okay, so what is investment? And this is where one decides, whether fully deliberately or subconsciously or somewhere in between, to expend some scarce resource that they have in the present in order to open up possibilities further into the future. Within lived conscious experience, the central elements available to us are time, attention, emotional energy, and mental effort. And every one of us has a finite amount of these elements. For example, your time is finite. Lost time is not recovered. When you waste time on some activities and you get nothing in return, this is irrational and can be harmful to your life, but time well spent should provide you with benefits. The same thing goes for your attention. You can focus your attention on anything you choose. Oftentimes, you receive happiness or pleasure through focusing your attention on certain things at any given moment. You are focusing your attention on something, and as these moments pass, there are always other possibilities that you did not focus on your attention on, but perhaps could have. So your attention is often pulled toward what is most salient, would be the shiny object, a loud voice, a provocative image in advertising, short-term pleasure that you might get from focusing your attention on these things can be addictive and can pull you into neurotic loops. What is salient in your consciousness is not necessarily what is most relevant to your life and to your long-term well-being. It is therefore wise to be mindful of your salience landscape and to train your attention to align with what is most relevant given your core values. Related to attention is mental effort, and you have the ability to use your mind and invest your mental computational power for tasks like solving problems or for figuring out what to do. Your invested mental effort has probably provided you already provided you with some payoff. Perhaps so many of you are making a living through your mental power. But we are living in quite complex times, and probably sometimes your mind gets overwhelmed. So it is wise to not overuse your mental effort and to allow yourself to recharge. And that feeling of being worn out, it is spent emotional energy. It's important to keep in mind that you also have finite emotional energy, which means that you have a certain capacity to care about something and to care about things in your life, and for certain people or objects or ideas to feel important to you. You can ask yourself whether you are investing your emotional energy for long-term general well-being and flourishing for yourself and for your loved ones, or perhaps whether too much of your emotional energy might be expended on rather trivial or frivolous things in life. And keep in mind that it is a matter of degree, and these examples I'm going to give are not meant to be judgmental with regard to what sort of things people should be investing their time into, their emotional energy into, but just to consider, there's some things that people have a tendency to get worked up over insignificant quarrels, or to get obsessed with, I don't know, sporting events or shows, or to constantly fret about current events. So we could ask ourselves whether it is worth the emotional energy that we are giving to these things. And also, perhaps we could invest more emotional energy into certain things. Perhaps you have some of it held up inside you that you could potentially deploy more generously to your family, to your community, and to the natural world in which we depend on for sustained life. Okay, so that's investment. What is influence? These are the most basic social and emotional factors that come into play when deciding how to act, including the self-other dynamic, the interplay of joy, sadness, power, and love. In the complexities of life, there might be multiple competing factors that are influencing your decision in different ways. One might, for example, be in a position where they have to choose between protecting power for oneself and empowering others. And there might be a trade-off between these two. This is something I deal with in community organizing, or between affiliation with certain people or hostility toward them, or somewhere in between. And in the flow of life, other people might have some influence over you. You might have some influence over them. At every step, you can take into account the balance, that's the positive or negative feelings, some degree of which that you would be experienced by yourself and by others. Along these dimensions, there are many factors that can be influencing you, and they're going to stand out more than others because they're salient, which can lead to impulsive decisions in some cases. Through some degree of reflection, you might be able to identify what factors are most relevant to yourself and to your loved ones. And ultimately, when you make a decision, it was because certain factors along these dimensions, self-other, affiliation, hostility, dominance, submission, ended up having the greatest influence over you and others. And finally, what is justification? This is where one communicates using spoken or written language or some other form of signs or symbols, and this is somehow derived from your needs and desires. And under the justification hypothesis, everything one expresses to others and also to your own self is some form of justification, and this is understood to stand in relation to investment and influence. This includes acts of casual conversation, arguments, narratives, explanations, excuses, and core beliefs about the self. So your acts of communication, every utterance, assertion, question, suggestion, or even every internal thought running through your mind ultimately has underlying motives that derive in large part from what you are investing in your conscious resources, and also from the core social and emotional influence factors, including yourself, others, power, and love. And all communicative acts and the thoughts are assumed to have some sort of purpose, which is to provide support for these things and what one wants to do or what wants to have happen or not happen. What is spoken is often indirectly related to the real underlying justification, and the person who speaks is not always fully aware of their own justifications for speaking. It is often difficult to sort out how our thoughts and our communicative acts stand in relation to the mental investment and the factors that influence us. And I have some more. I'm not sure if I have a minute or two, or did we want to move on?
That's actually, I appreciate that, Brandon. That's really, really well said. I really appreciate just bringing attention to the dynamics of investment, influence, and justification. These are crucial lenses to see. Things are running a little late, and I'll say I'll be hanging around beyond 3 o'clock. I did want to give Andrew an opportunity and then see if there are other folks within the psychology group that wanted to share anything personal. Andrew's got a really cool frame of reference that I'd like to hear from and invite other people. And again, we'll take questions after everyone's in the psychology groups had a chance to talk, and then we'll have an opportunity for dialogue. I'll be hanging around beyond 3 o'clock as needed. So, Andrew?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we'll be hanging around. And mine will be really fast. Mine's probably going to be different because my background, I'm not a philosopher. I'm not a psychologist. I'm really just a regular dude. I've owned an IT business. I've been in IT for years and discovered this work. I discovered Wilber's work in like the early 2000s and then kind of followed that tree, looked a lot into Whitehead, and ultimately found Greg and John Bard, that kind of mindset. And so for me, for psychology, I had to figure out, okay, what do I do with this? Because I'm not going to write books. I'm not going to produce podcasts. I'm going to go to work every Monday morning. I've got kiddos. I've got a wife. I'm in a small community, but I love this shit and I care about this and I want to invest. So what do I do? So I started to kind of back up. And of course, I built my basic worldview, or what we would call psychology. So I kind of figured out, how do I know what's true? What's my basic ontology, epistemology sort of framework? What's my big history? How do I know who I am, where I came from? So I kind of figured that out. And then kind of what I see in the future in transcendence and in, I want to be a good ancestor and that kind of thing. And so I built all that for myself and it really worked. But then I needed some kind of operating system for what do I do on Tuesday at 12:30, or what do I do on Saturday at 1:42 to promote these kind of values and not just have it in kind of book knowledge, etc. I needed something I could grip. I needed something I could do quickly and kind of do a scan of my life and environment. So I came up with a little acronym. In my day job, I work in IT. I'm in project management. So I do a lot. I try to organize things. So this will probably only work for maybe 20% of people. So if you're not a list person, if you're not into that, trash it. It's not your psychology. Who cares? But for some of you, I think this could help. And for me, once I divided it up into a small acronym, I can fly through it very quickly, do a health check, both up the stack and down the stack existentially, and east and west with my fellow humans, and really find if I'm healthy. And I can feel when I'm off center, when I'm off balance, and then I know how to correct it. So that's really what my psychology was all about. I divided it into 3 major areas: love or relationships, work, and play. So we have to love, we have to work, and we have to play. And then I asked, who's doing the loving, working, and playing? And I thought, well, it's Andrew. And so that then it's essentially, for lack of a better word for the philosophers, was the subject. So I took those 4 and said, what's most important? Relationships is most important. So I started with R. Andrew then is the next important, because Andrew has to be that subject that can do all that. So I used E as emergence. You could use maybe E as evolution or E as expansion, but I like to say E as emergence. Then I did A as administrative work. It's just shit that has to happen. I've got to work. I got to have inputs. I got to have outputs. It's real. And then the L stands for leisure and legacy. So it basically says an acronym: real. Relationships, emergence, administrative activities, leisure and legacy activities. So what I did, I'll just share this out real quick. Instead of doing like a presentation, I just figured I'd show you my little list. And this is just kind of how I do it. And I review it once a week. It helps me center and ground. Then I do kind of a quarterly review for a larger, and then an annual review. It centers me, gets me on track, keeps me moving forward. So it's very practical, not very theoretical.
And one of the, and real, I found that I definitely wanted Andrew to do that, because actually, for me, and obviously, I'm doing lots of different kinds of stuff, but actually relationships, emergence, administration, leisure, and legacy, it really is a really powerful heuristic. I mean, you want to drop right into it, and that's why I love Andrew. Is like, get real, stay clear, be deep, but be really accessible, pragmatic, and grounded. And that's what I found that to be. And so I wanted to share that. And I also love, especially kind of like, this is what psychology is. You think about the way Marcia talked and I talked, and then what Baron's doing and Rob, and then we see that. So I want to give I'll just go around and see. I know Luke had to leave. He was, but planning on saying something. Bob, Owen, Damon, if anybody, Brendan, if anybody has anything that's part of the psychology group that would like to offer something, now's the time. I want to let that, no pressure. Everybody shared things at various times. I'll see if they want to do that. Go ahead, Owen.
I'll just say that as a songwriter, the psychology of kind of trying to spin up a psyche, accessible psyche for someone else as a listener, listening to a song, to kind of simulate a psyche that they can enter into is it's been pretty interesting thinking about these lenses. Marcia, what you said about making the relevant salient is kind of what I think a good song should be. It should, and Rob, I think a good song should also grab some of those items from level 5 markers when it can, kind of share that non-duality, share that oneness in a accessible psyche. So a song is kind of a simulation of a psyche that has been interesting to try to build using these various, by opacifying the lenses and making it shareable and some kind of artifact. So that's one big benefit that I've got from all this, and that's what I wanted to contribute.
Great. I appreciate that, Owen. And, one of the things that I'm grossly underdeveloped on is music. So it's so nice to actually hear somebody who's well developed in that. And when we are thinking about fifth joint point and we are thinking about our natures, I am 100% convinced that music, art, are the kind, if we're actually going to have an impact, it will be through those kinds of venues, those kinds of participatory dynamics, those kinds of things that afford a sense of collective embodied participatory resonance, rather than, $6,000 words coming from structures like me. So let's play songs in relation. So let me throw that out there. But anyway. Rob, you can go ahead.
Yeah. So I just want to say I love that from Owen, and that invitation into, pulling the seat out at the table for a certain kind of psyche to come online is fantastic. But it also made me sort of think about how theory of mind, right, is not always there in children, but we get to this point where we become functionally capable of modeling other people's minds, et cetera. And you could argue that, in some pathologies, we lose or don't have or maybe overvalue modeling other people's minds through codependency or whatever. So psychopathy, et cetera. There's weirdness there. Back to the, if we can escape our own psychology with an awareness that objectifies this selving function, you really do start to see the selving function in everyone else, even though, we're all unique snowflakes. There's a motivational loop there that is very discernible, and you can start to understand and have not only love for yourself, like, oh, there I was solving again, being an ego, of course, right? I wanted the cake, or I wanted the love, or I wanted the whatever, and there's a backup to love that, but it also lets you love these other people and understand this engine of a certain psycheology that we all might fall into, whether it's really amazing or really poor. But anyway, that trigger of thinking about, like, how do you craft a song or a space, or even in a talk, like, what's the, again, we did these so short, we couldn't really do tons of experiential stuff, but like an invitation into a different way of seeing, or longer stories and stuff, can really shift somebody's psychology. And it's a very powerful thing, and it should be done with wisdom.
Yeah, song can generate that awe and that insight sometimes, not always, but some of that's an aspiration.
I'm a musician too. I just wanted to quickly say that I see songs and film, but specifically music, as taking the ideas, for example, the ones expressed today, and putting them in a mimetic form that spreads to the collective intelligence, and it's doing a entrainment function. It's harmonizing the collective whole. And without that, you don't have any way to spread that structure to the entire network.
Lovely. Bob?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, after the demise of UTOK Circle, I went looking for a substitute forum, and so I put a link in the chat to where I'm hanging out nowadays. My jam is extreme meta-theoretical, cross-disciplinary integration of all this stuff. My main focus is social science, world history, politics, and tech, so I'm sort of harvesting UTOK ideas and applying them. I noticed in the chat some people are connecting Mind4 and Gebser. That's the sort of place that I live a lot, but I'm not going to go into the details here, way too long. But, if you want to get into big theoretical jams on that stuff, that link I gave you is where I can be found.
Great. Thanks so much. Yeah, it's so important. Here's another sort of on the ground angle, fifth joint point, and there's so many different ways to talk about consciousness, etc. The short one is the technology is going to interface with us to create a new complexified structure. And we need people working on that. We need people thinking about that. We need people hiring into the workforce for it that actually have a big picture view that has the capacity to orient toward wisdom. And Bob is a great place in relationship to that. Brendan.
Well, I know there's only 5 minutes left in this session, but yeah, what came up for me during Rob's presentation is like something I'd love to explore more. And maybe real quick, I'd also just like to get Greg, maybe your thoughts on it. I feel like it deserves its own session, because this has been an enduring question for me as I've explored these big pictures, and this question of the relation of non-duality and spirit and Geist and God, and where this all fits in the map. And I was sort of unhappy with, well, I mean, I have a lot of appreciation for integral maps and Ken Wilber's work, but it didn't quite click for me entirely. And yet, so I see Rob making an interesting move there, and part of me is all in on that, but then it raises big theoretical questions. So anyway, it's a mixture of questions for Rob. Maybe at some time if we could unpack that more, but maybe just for the time allotted. Yeah, I'd be curious, Greg, to hear your thoughts about alternative ways of conceiving that layer beyond, as maybe not this kind of digital AI layer, but something more akin to, non-dual kind of consciousness or something like that. So I'm just curious how that lands for you.
Yeah. Maybe we'll schedule something. This is a huge conversation. It's a huge
I'd be
conversation.
happy to do that. It'd be great.
And, and me and Rob meet regularly, and we find, I think, a nice dialectic around this set of ideas. And there's even tension, like how much isness is isness before. But when do you grip again, and what is knowing, and what's value? And, I think they're really cool conversations to be had in relationship to this. One thing I'll say very quickly is that there really is two lines in the fifth joint point. There's what is after the ego and an ego persona, a Mind4 kind of thing. If we're just going up the stack in a multiple complexification structure, there's a self-recursion on the ego persona. that there's a transpersonal kind of mind 4-ish on the one hand, and we definitely need some sort of stack complexification, clearly. And so there's a stack, like you talk about, actually, there's already a stack. And at the same time, UTOK at least is saying, hey, you get a totally different qualitative shift if you open up a new complex adaptive plane that affords novel information processing, communication networks, and information interface. Well, that's the internet. That's LLMs that network us together in a digital global plane, at least at the medium level, and afford a particular kind of intelligence, whatever you want to use that word as. But fundamentally, so it's both of those things clearly right off the bat at some level, right? And then how we relate to those things. And of course, it's a mythos. It's the myth of the fifth joint point, right? It hasn't, it's happening. It hasn't happened. We're co-constructing it it's a transcendent emergent event, to use a Bardian frame. So it's all of this, and it's a beautiful thing to kind of come together and wonder about. So let's just have a conversation.
Yeah, I would just propose, it sounds like there's a lot of interest in this topic as well. So I'd propose that maybe Greg, you and I can work together to organize some kind of a group, because I know we're also coming together, we're coming to the end of the conference, but I'd love to organize a meetup with whoever wants to join. We could record it and put it out there. And so Greg, let's talk and maybe we can set that up.
I'm
Beautiful.
interested.
Yeah. Fifth joint point reality. Okay. Perfect. Bobby, you've had your hand up, so go ahead, and then Baron.
Yeah. Okay. So my mind's been kind of blown, and I don't want to seem hyperbolic. The reason I'm so happy about it is because things were expressed that have been things that I've been working on for a year, and you don't know if it's going to resonate. So I'm writing a book, and basically I thought it was going to be Greek, and now I'm seeing a convergence that's really exciting. I want to first push back on kind of the way that Greg framed it, but at the same time, give a criticism that's actually a bigger compliment. So you said that science is kind of this third person thing and it doesn't model this. That was what the point I was making in my talk, is that you have to constantly extend your scientific model, and that psychology is precisely the science of the future. It's psychology, and it's not just that. You can map it to basically what you're talking about is higher order cybernetics and computational neuroscience. And as a neuroscientist, the computational neuroscience revolution over the last decade is taking things like integrated information theory, and you can actually get an information geometry for qualia, and you can start understanding it in terms of these dialectical relationships. Like if you're a system with two states, you can only know basically like on and off, light, dark. And when you expand that, you can start to see a structure where the whole qualia space emerges. So what I want to say is the meta science that you're doing right now is what I've been looking for. It's the next iteration of psychology. People like Jung were starting to go here, but now you're doing it in a precise way where you're mapping out the mind as a hierarchical structure. And we're seeing that every time that you map the mind and you say there's these 3 minds, now there's 4 minds, and then you become aware of that whole stack, you are transcending that. And there's actually a cognitive correlate where you're getting a new type of phenomena with new causal dynamics that require extension of not just your scientific framework, but your mathematical framework. New formalisms come into existence. And so the ontology that Baron had is the ontology we need. You got to place the tree in this cosmic thing, and we're co-creators. And then Rob's explained the self as this lattice of selves, because we have an internal family system. We model others, and our decisions are sort of a weighted average of calling on that internal family system. So I think Rob is getting at a new higher level science that you can actually bridge to these non-equilibrium statistical mechanics, probabilistic learning. Kind of blew my mind when Bonita was like, I don't think this is the future of science, is complexity science and inference. And the meta stuff is taking it to a new level, because you're going into that psychology space and you're actually saying the mind is real. Let's look at what it's doing when it's looking at each other. That's recursive modeling. You can find computational models too. And it's not reducing it to math. It's actually saying humanity is creating new science. You're just taking the ability of science to model things. You can model anything. If it exists, you can create a dynamical model of it. So that's all I want to say.
All right. Thank you, friend. I'll be happy to have more dialogue with you. I think we're in large agreement. Baron, and then Alexander.
Great. So it's been super awesome. I did want to say to our audience, just in terms of what I presented and Rob, that uh, hopefully you would see most of it is nearly synonymous to identical um, awareness. I kind of think of it again as like a source, this phenomenologically is the source and the content, right? And that's nothing new within contemplative traditions. What I'm trying to emphasize is that in some contemplative traditions, there's there sometimes is a temptation to ignore the ego and just think of it as a bad thing versus to actually say, oh, it's like a function, just like I have hands. So I'm not my hands, but I have them. They're tools and it has a function and it's in the programming, it's in the memory of the system we're embedded in our psyches. So it's better to bring that on board and pacify, kind of like the lenses Rob would talk about of like, they're good to look through at the world, but not to look from. And so the pacification process is to look from. And then the other thing, just that I put a little emphasis about the T with the idea of, you could have a Ramana Maharshi who's in a deep presence of awareness and he's just in the bliss, right? And that's a, is that the one of the goals, which I would say from a nature perspective, yes. And from a social perspective, we all still got to make shit. We still have goods and services that we're doing and making for each other. So at that kind of fifth joint point, probably, and this probably would tie into kind of maybe a later conversation, is that to me, that fifth joint point has both this kind of wisdom, right? And this is nothing new to you, Greg, right? Or Rob, of it has the wisdom we need within us as individuals, but then across us as a civilization. And that I do think, though, I do think that the digital technological is what can change that, because throughout human history, we've had this awareness understanding, and they're just different words and different concepts, and little and groups of people and religions of people find it. But like, if you look in our consumerism and our Western world, like, there are pockets of people who get this, but how do you get something at scale? And I do think, and I could be wrong, but I do think that both the digital and wearables and implantables, which certainly can provoke some people, will be part of how we do that and develop that coherence, which will then kind of keep going. So anyway, just wanted to say that.